Hello everyone, welcome back to Simply Static, and welcome to my first episode in my true crime series. Now this first story you're about to hear is truly horrific. I've left some of the more gruesome details out of respect to the victim and their family, and also to abide by YouTube's terms of service. Now with that said, in addition to introducing this kind of content in a new format, I wanted to do it in a way that was respectful and mindful of the subject matter. So, generally speaking, my true crime series will definitely be on a more serious note. Please remember that every story you hear in this series is 100% real, and I'm hoping that the topics I cover here can bring more awareness. But with all that said, let's get ready for story number 1. This is the horrific story of James Patterson Smith. The story begins one afternoon in April 1996. A man named James Patterson Smith walked calmly into a Manchester police station in England and reported to them that his girlfriend had accidentally drowned in his bathtub. Smith was 48 years old, while his girlfriend was only 17. As the police would soon find out, his girlfriend did drown, but it wasn't an accident. Not only had she been drowned, the police would find out she had been subjected to 3 weeks of some of the most brutal and sadistic torture England had ever seen. The crime scene was so horrific, it even brought seasoned police officers to tears. The victim of this tragedy was Kellyanne Bates, and she was mature for her age. At the age of 14, Kelly told her parents, named Margaret and Tommy Bates, that she had a boyfriend, but they didn't know about him. And as any parents would, they assumed her boyfriend was just a teenage crush, just someone from school. Her parents had always given her a long leash, wanting to raise their children with a sense of independence. And it wasn't long before Kelly started staying out overnight, leaving her parents worried and calling police on several occasions. When Kelly was finally home, she told them she was simply staying at her friend Rachel's house. But they suspected something else. They had a sinking feeling that story wasn't true. And unfortunately, they turned out to be right. They weren't just concerned about where Kelly was staying. They knew they had never met her boyfriend and didn't know where he lived. Kelly had only ever told them that his name was Dave, and even he would occasionally call them up and ask where she was. But as they would find out later, these calls were just part of Dave's plan to manipulate them and to tighten the noose of control he had around Kelly. Dave's manipulation was so successful, Kelly managed to keep her parents from ever meeting Dave for over 2 years. And at the age of 16, that's when Kelly informed her parents that she was dropping out of school. Kelly's parents were understandably horrified and livid. But that's when she told them it went further. Not only was she dropping out of school, she was going to be moving in with Dave, the person they still hadn't met, and who they still assumed was just another boy. Just some schoolmate she was infatuated with, and certainly her same age. But as they would learn, that was far from the truth. Completely distraught and terrified, her parents had little choice but to go to the police. Unfortunately, under UK law, at the age of 16, Kelly could make her own decisions. And the police told Kelly's parents that unfortunately, there was nothing they could do. But not wanting to give up on their daughter, Kelly's parents demanded to meet this boy, Dave. And fortunately, they did wind up meeting him. But unfortunately, they realized the situation they found their daughter in was far worse than they expected. When they finally met Dave, they were horrified to discover he wasn't a boy. He was a full-grown man. But the lies didn't stop. They tried to pass Dave off as only 32 years old, when in reality, he was 48, and older than Kelly's own father was at the time. But what they had yet to discover was that Dave wasn't his name at all. This was actually James Patterson Smith. Kelly's parents didn't know what to do. They couldn't understand what was going through the mind of their beloved daughter. And even though they knew Kelly was mature for her age, unfortunately she was still young and very naive. Initially, she was very flattered by the idea of an older man paying so much interest in her. And while Kelly's mind was swimming with ideas of love, she didn't realize that their relationship was more about power and control than love. And by this point in their relationship, James was controlling every aspect of this young girl's life. Over time, Kelly's entire demeanor changed. Her personality changed. She was no longer the bubbly and bright girl her mother knew. They would gradually see less and less of her over time. When she did show up, she seemed troubled, confused, depressed, but always insisted everything was okay and that nothing was wrong. Even when she would start showing up with bruises on her hands, arms, and face, Kelly's parents knew the situation was getting out of control, and they desperately feared for their daughter. And on one day, their concerns reached new levels when Kelly showed up with the entire half of her face black and blue. Kelly tried to lie to her mother again and told her that she had just been jumped by a group of girls from her school. But her parents knew better. Kelly always had an answer for what was going on. She always had an excuse. But what she didn't realize was that her parents saw through it. They tried to offer Kelly help. Her mother pleaded with her to go see a doctor so they could document her injuries and they could report the abuse. But because she was 16, she couldn't be compelled to do it. And unless Kelly decided to go of her own accord, her parents were helpless. They could only watch and wait. Even when her mother discovered bite marks on her body, Kelly still refused to see the truth. She tried to pass those injuries off as coming from a chain link fence. By November 1995, Kelly's parents became increasingly desperate. Kelly's mother pleaded with her to leave Smith. But his abuse wasn't just physical. It was mental and emotional as well. Smith's abuse and manipulation managed to poison Kelly against her parents. She had been coerced by Smith into seeing what he wanted her to see. And in response to her mother's pleading with her that she leave Smith, she became angry instead and told her mother that she would be seeing much less of her going forward. She stormed out, leaving her mother feeling helpless and alone, not realizing that would be the last time she would ever see her daughter alive again. She would continue to phone her parents every so often over the next few months. She had told her that she got a factory job and was working really long hours and weekends, and that's why she hadn't come around. But eventually, she stopped calling altogether. Given all the lies she had told them so far, her parents didn't know what to think. But their suspicions and fear turned to dread when in March 1996, they received 2 cards in the mail. One was a birthday card for her father, and the other was a Mother's Day card. Both cards had clearly been written by someone other than Kelly. Her parents knew her handwriting, and these cards were clearly not written by Kelly. There was only one explanation. Smith had finally taken complete control and was now toying with them. And a day that no parent should ever have to live through came on April 17th, 1996, when James Patterson Smith walked into the Gordon police station and reported to them that his girlfriend had drowned in the bathtub. The police that arrived were met with a horrific bloodbath that obviously was more than separate injuries, which included stab wounds to nearly every part of Kelly's body, to the point where nearly every room in Smith's house contained traces of Kelly's blood. They also determined that Kelly had suffered dramatic weight loss in the amount of 45 pounds by being deprived of food and water right before Smith savagely took her life. Police investigations had determined that this depraved act of inhumanity was the culmination of a violent pattern of behavior by Smith. They discovered that years before, Smith had divorced his wife due to allegations of violence, and that after his divorce, he had dated a 21-year-old girl who testified that Smith used her as a punching bag, even though she was pregnant, and that relationship ended when Smith tried to drown her, and that before he met Kelly, he tried to drown another 15-year-old girl. And to the shock of the court, Smith tried to deny murder charges and tried to justify his torture of Kelly by claiming that she had taunted him about the death of his own mother, and that she had only herself to blame. And to add further insult, he also claimed that she had, quote, a habit of hurting herself to make it look worse on me, end quote. Later on, when he was asked why he took Kelly's eyes from her, he said, quote, she dared me to do it. The jury in Smith's case didn't even need a full hour before they came back with a guilty verdict. The evidence photos that the jury saw were so horrific that after the trial, every single member of the jury accepted the offer of psychological counseling. Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. And as of the date of this recording, Smith is still in prison. This story was extremely horrific, and unfortunately, there are many other monsters that still live among us that haven't been caught. I want to make it clear for my listeners that I do not in any way believe in victim blaming, and while to some it may seem that Kelly made her own decisions, that clearly was not the case. Kelly was unequivocally a victim of Smith's manipulation and abuse. She was an innocent child who fell victim to a monster. And so, I want to encourage my listeners. If you, or someone you love, is a victim of domestic violence, please reach out. There is help, and you are not alone. Now, even though James Patterson Smith is still serving his life sentence, it doesn't do anything to make Kelly's family whole again. Kelly was laid to rest one day before her 18th birthday. May she rest in peace. Please see the description box below for more information on abuse and domestic violence. The murder of Nicole Legger. Nicole Legger was no stranger to difficulties in her life. At 17, she was a stunning beauty, but found herself pregnant and unmarried at age 17. So to make ends meet, she took a job as an exotic dancer in the Dallas area. But things were looking up as she entered her 30s. She was now working for a stockbroker as an assistant, was enrolled as a nursing student while her son attended high school. She also found herself in a relationship with a man that treated her wonderfully. That man was named Mike Adams. Mike Adams was 16 years older than Nicole and made a living repossessing vehicles when people didn't pay their bills. He actually did quite well for himself. He lived in a nice new home in an affluent Dallas suburb called Frisco. Now it's important to know that when Mike and Nicole first started dating, he acted like the perfect gentleman. He often wrote her love notes and brought her flowers. Things were going so well, it wasn't long before Mike asked Nicole and her son Trey to move in with them. But unfortunately, things fell apart quickly. Now it would turn out that Mike was a very obsessive individual. He was obsessed with the cleanliness and order of every item in his home, and to say he was merely meticulous about his luxury home was an understatement. Absolutely everything had to be in perfect order. Everything in the closets, the cupboards, the refrigerator, all needed to be perfectly on point and organized. Even the labels had to be facing the same direction, as if on display in the supermarket. He had an expensive pool table that was strictly a showpiece and never used. And of course the same rule applied to his fancy white couch. No one was allowed to sit on it, as he was constantly worried that using it might get the couch dirty. For Mike, order was his absolute obsession. He even ordered his extensive handgun collection to be sorted by caliber size. But on one night, Nicole and her son Trey would come face to face with the rage that would be induced in Mike if anything went wrong, or if any of his rules were broken. One evening, Mike decided to make spaghetti for Nicole. He knew it was her favorite meal, but Trey made the mistake of spilling a tiny bit of spaghetti sauce on the floor. Now, even though this would have been a very easy mess to clean up, Mike couldn't handle it, and he flew into a rage that lasted over a week. And of course, after being subjected to this, Nicole and her son moved out, less than 2 months after they had moved in. The yelling and fits of rage were too much for anyone to handle. But no woman had ever left him before. He had to do something. So he decided to turn on the charm again. He invited Nicole out to a restaurant one night where he would be the perfect gentleman. He apologized to Nicole profusely and told her he would never yell at her again if she just came back. The evening went quite well after that, and Mike brought Nicole back to his house and proposed. Nicole would wind up accepting that proposal, and she decided to move back in. But things did not go as promised. Almost immediately after moving back in, the arguments began again, and they escalated. The yelling got so heated that during one argument, Mike forcefully ripped off the ring from Nicole's finger, which of course caused a fracture, requiring a trip to the hospital. Not wanting to put up with more abuse from Mike, she and her son decided to get a new apartment across town and tried to put this horrible past behind them. But unfortunately, things would not return to normal. One evening, Nicole returned home from work to find her front door wide open and her dog nowhere to be found. It was only a few days later they found out the dog was hit by a car and had died. On another occasion, Nicole came home to find someone had broken into their home and poured bleach all over their clothing. These invasions of their privacy and the sanctity of their home started small, but eventually escalated to her car mysteriously catching fire while parked outside her apartment. Of course, Nicole suspected Mike was behind these events, but she had no way to prove it. Now, Mike knew that Nicole couldn't afford to buy a new car, so he decided to seize the opportunity to come to her rescue and offered to co-sign her for a new loan. She believed she had no other choice, so she accepted the offer. And in March 2013, Nicole wanted Mike to sign off on the new car title, so she took the title to his house. All she needed was his signature, and she'd be done with him. She desperately wanted Mike out of her life for good, but she also needed to pick up some things she left at his house, so she figured she'd do both at the same time. Retrieve her things and get his signature, and then she'd be done. Mike decided to turn on the charm again and offered to make her more spaghetti. Mike claimed he was only trying to make peace, but unfortunately, peace was the last thing on his mind. What Mike really wanted was utter control and revenge. The drug Mike used to spike the pasta sauce didn't take long to take effect, and Nicole wound up incapacitated for hours. But Nicole was at least partially aware before the drug took its full effect. She remembered being walked into a bedroom and Mike taking off her clothes. was a sadistic violation of her mind and body. When Nicole finally woke up, she found herself still naked and hog-tied, which means her hands were bound behind her back and secured to her ankles. She found herself unable to scream because her mouth was gagged with duct tape. But through that fear and adrenaline, and a steadfast determination to survive, Nicole managed to free herself. She ran to the nearest neighbor's house, still naked, screaming and banging on the door. But unfortunately, Mike heard her screams before the neighbor did, and he swiftly dragged her back into the house through the garage. Inside the garage, Mike had placed a large plastic tarp on the floor. He then decided to handcuff her and bind her ankles with zip ties. Mike had become incensed and was driven by rage. He attempted to rip her hair out with his hands, but couldn't manage it. So he turned to a knife. Nicole was absolutely terrified, but she wanted to survive. By this point, she had been held captive for over 24 hours. Mike hadn't killed her yet, so maybe there was a chance that he wouldn't, if she could only reach him, if she could only reason with him. She knew there wasn't anything reasonable about Mike, but she figured maybe if she could make Mike believe her that she wouldn't leave him, maybe there was a chance. So, Nicole promised him that she wouldn't press charges if he let her go, and she vowed to stay with him. She vowed they would stay together and that they would go to couples counseling and work everything out. This process took quite a while, but eventually, she managed to convince Mike that she was telling the truth. And he finally agreed and let her go. Amazingly, Nicole was so convincing, he let her leave the house, and then she went right to the police and reported the assault. She told them everything and pleaded with them to go lock him up. The police explained that if they did that, she'd have to testify against him. And she said, quote, "He's going to end up killing me," unquote. The police went out and searched Mike's car and house and discovered that he had planned to get rid of the evidence by hiding it in his trunk. In his trunk, they found the intimate toys, the zip ties, and the duct tape, with her hair still attached. They even found the near-empty jar of spiked spaghetti sauce. The detective in charge of the investigation was a man named Scott Greer, and they wound up arresting Mike, charging him with assault and unwanted restraint. But Mike had means, and was immediately let go after posting bail. Because of his release, Nicole was granted an emergency protective order against him. The order stated Mike was to have no contact with her at all. As another layer of protection, Nicole and her son moved 20 miles away to Melissa, Texas, in an entirely different county. She even went as far as using a friend's name to rent a home and set up her utilities, in hopes that Mike wouldn't be able to find her. She said, quote, "I feel like he will show up at my door or car at any time," unquote. Mike realized that the only reason she had this restraining order was because she made complaints about him to the police, and this made Mike furious. He knew that at trial, she would be testifying against him. Not caring about the order, he left a not-so-subtle threat on her doorstep one day. Nicole came home from work one day to find some handcuffs and a plastic tarp laid on her front porch. Nicole and her son were obviously terrified. In August 2013, she and her son decided to visit her father in Florida to get away for a little while. Nicole's father pleaded with her to stay. He said that there was nothing worth going back to Texas for, but Nicole didn't listen. She wanted to testify against Mike, to stop him from ever doing this to anyone again, and to get justice for what she had to go through at his hand. But unfortunately, that was the last time she saw her father. Nicole's 17-year-old son, Trey, came home from school one day to find his mother dead on September 9th, 2013. because he worked for a repossession company. Mike had used a GPS tracking device and attached it to her car to track her every move. Police quickly arrested Mike Adams and charged him with capital murder. Capital murder is a term only used in 7 states, which means the crime is eligible for punishment by execution. The crime scene investigators looked thoroughly at all the evidence. They found 2 used condoms at the scene, neither of which had Mike's DNA or matched anyone else in the police database. But Mike did wind up making a mistake. A small piece of Mike's DNA was found on the outside of one of the condoms. It was clear to police that Mike was trying to plant evidence. Further evidence of his plan and intentions were found on his work computer, where he had researched different routes to her house in Melissa, Texas. But the most damning evidence was found in a storage locker he had listed in his ex-wife's name. There they found a massive arsenal of guns, one of which proved ballistically to be the gun that Mike used to take Nicole's life. After his trial, the jury in Mike's case found him guilty. He was convicted of capital murder, and in the state of Texas, capital murder carries an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The 2 stories I've narrated here in this video are meant to be a sobering example that there can be dire consequences to domestic violence when nothing is done. Domestic violence is real and should always be taken seriously. Police and judges are far too quick to dismiss the fears of women who claim domestic violence. It's far easier to think someone's exaggerating the problem, or to pretend there's no problem at all. Maybe that's a human trait, or maybe it's something that desperately needs to change, because people's lives hang in the balance. No human being should ever have to lose their life, their health, or their mental and emotional well-being at the hands of another, for any reason. And while these 2 stories are extreme examples of domestic violence, it's important to remember it doesn't have to be physical to be domestic violence. Controlling and manipulative behaviors, keeping someone from their friends and family, gaslighting, and many other sadistic and manipulative behaviors fall under the same category. Any behavior that's obsessively and excessively controlling can be considered domestic violence, and is definitely